Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm going to take a few minutes today to break down how to do your intro and conclusion, and I'm going to do so using this presentation right here. Now, what you're going to need to do first is, if you haven't written those body paragraphs, that needs to be taken care of, or else this will be a lot harder to do. I know some people like writing their paper first and writing the introduction. How I generally view that is, how do I know how I'm going to introduce something if I haven't written it yet? So I usually try to start with writing those body paragraphs first, making sure I have a thesis statement so I know where I'm going, but then going back and writing the introduction later. And I'm using my hands a lot, so I'm sorry. It's a hands type of day. Okay, so getting into your introduction first. So why do I need an introduction? This is important because you're trying to lay the foundation of your paper. The purpose of your introduction isn't only to just say what the heck you're talking about, it's also to gain your reader's interest, right? It's like a first impression. So this is your reader's first impression of what you're going to be talking about. Now, luckily, we do have an introduction formula that you can follow. So the first thing you're going to want to do is come up with some sort of attention getter. Now, I'm going to get more into all three of these different components for this formula. So right now, I'm just going to introduce you to what those are. So attention getter comes first. This can be one or more sentences. It should capture your reader's interest. Your next step is going to be to put the background information or overview. This is where you just generally introduce what the issue is and the different sides. And at that point, your side should be starting to stand out. And just one thing I've been noticing as I've been looking through some of your drafts, make sure you're not saying, I believe. So like, instead of saying, I believe that prisons need to be reformed, I would say prisons need to be reformed because. So because this is research-based and because you're backing up your opinion with research, you don't need to say, I think or I believe. Lastly, you're going to put your thesis statement. Most of you have already developed this in the steps leading up to your conclusion and your introduction, so you should already have that. But remember, your thesis is going to be a strong statement and then your three main argument points. So the first thing that you're going to try to do when you're coming up with your intro is you're going to figure out how to get your reader's attention. I personally think the hardest part about writing anything is starting. So an attention getter is helpful because it's a way to just quickly get your reader's interest and to let them know what you're talking about. So there are different ways you can begin your introduction. You first want to start with a couple of sentences, like I said, that are of high interest. Now, a couple ways you can do this. You could start with a story or an anecdote that relates to your topic. So if I'm talking about prison reform, maybe I'm going to talk about a situation in which prison reform had positive outcome or a negative outcome, and use an actual personal story to make it more relatable. I could also start with an interesting or startling fact or piece of information. I could also just make a bold statement. So if you are really struggling to come up with your attention getter, my suggestion would be to start your intro by just boldly stating what you're addressing. So keep in mind those strategies when you're coming up with your attention getter. Again, you want to start with something interesting, but don't stress out too much about this part because, again, the meat of your paper is going to come from those body paragraphs. Your next step is going to be to just provide some background information. So assume that your reader knows a little bit about your issue, but maybe doesn't know the ins and outs. So you're just going to provide a couple sentences that gives an overview of the issue itself. And this should expand upon your attention getter, right? So if I start with the story about somebody who went through the criminal justice system, maybe had a negative experience, I would then use that to talk about some of the background information regarding my issue. So this part, again, you're just giving some background information so your reader has a better understanding of the issue itself. Now, the most important part of your introduction is going to be your thesis statement. As I stated, you most likely already have this, so this will be a quick refresher, but we also have a formula for that. So what you're going to do for your thesis statement is you are going to put a strong statement of your viewpoint, and then you are going to list the three main arguments that you have. Now, your strong statement needs to specifically state which side of the debatable issue you are on and that this paper is going to cover. Again, don't use personal pronouns like I believe or anything like that. And then each of your arguments, so argument 1, argument 2, and argument 3, each of your arguments are going to become your body paragraphs. So the first argument you list is going to then become your focus in body paragraph 1. Second argument you list will become the focus of your second body paragraph, and so on and so forth. So make sure that your arguments here line up with what your body paragraphs are addressing. So let's go ahead and take a look at the example right here. Now, notice how it marks out what the attention getter is in red, what the background information is in blue, and the thesis statement in orange. So pay close attention to that as we read through. The United States has the highest prison population in the world. Most people would agree that prisons keep the country safe and they protect vulnerable populations. However, more needs to be done to stop the violence and harsh conditions seen in the U.S. penal system. Prisons themselves are necessary, but if the country does not change prison policy, the country will continue to have an unjust system that does not rehabilitate individuals. There needs to be prison reform in the United States because it'll make prisons safer, reduce recidivism, and save taxpayers money. All right, so my attention getter, one quick sentence. I have a couple sentences that address what the debate is even about here or what the issue is, and then I specifically state what is going to be talked about in this paper. So just by looking at this, I know that this paper is going to argue that there needs to be prison reform in the United States. And then I know the first paragraph will focus on how that'll make prisons safer. It also, my second body paragraph, will focus on how prison reform will reduce recidivism rates. And then my third body paragraph is going to focus on how it's going to save taxpayers money. So this is not a super long paragraph, but it does address what is going to specifically be covered in my paper. And that's the point of your introduction ultimately. All right, so that's all you need to worry about for the introduction. Moving on to our conclusion. So again, there is a formula for writing your conclusion. The purpose of your conclusion is to synthesize your main points and to leave your reader with something to think about. Now, you're going to be synthesizing the information that you've provided throughout your entire paper thus far, and then you're going to want your reader to have something to think about and something of interest. So let's break that down a little bit more. What I mean by synthesize is you want to synthesize your ideas, not summarize. So you don't just want to repeat and regurgitate what you already said in your paper. You want to show how it fits together. So think of it like a puzzle. So when you're doing a puzzle, you're putting the pieces together. When you're coming up with your conclusion, you're showing how body paragraph 1 and what you talked about there fits in with body paragraph 2 and body paragraph 3. So you want to make it clear how all the pieces fit together for your conclusion. Now, just to provide a little bit of information, because I know sometimes, again, the hardest part of any paper is starting it and finishing it. You want to leave your reader with something to think about, is what I had mentioned before. Here's a strategy that I find very helpful. It's called the so what strategy. You want to ask yourself, so what? Why should anybody care about this topic? So again, if I'm using the example of prison reform, why should somebody who has never been to prison or doesn't know anybody in prison really even care about this paper or this topic in general? So I need to think through why they should care and try to address that in my conclusion here. Now, some other ways that you can draw interest and get your reader to think are listed right here. So you can call people to action. So trying to provide ways that people can address this issue in their own communities. You can just reiterate the significance and state why this is something that's so relevant for people in today's society, especially teenagers. You can ask a provocative question. So questions can be effective. Don't just ask a question like, what do you believe about prison reform? You want to ask a question that really gets people to think. And I'll show you an example of that in the example I'm about to give you of a conclusion. You can also end with a warning. So what's going to happen if your issue is not addressed correctly? And then you could also propose a solution. So try to think of a creative way to address the issue you're discussing. maybe it addresses both sides of the issue, and that's okay too. So use your conclusion to give some final thoughts. Don't just restate exactly what you've already talked about. So here's an example conclusion. While many people in the United States do not think about the criminal justice system on a daily basis, the ripple effects of the flawed system impact everyone. People may try to ignore the problems within the criminal justice system. However, what does it say about this country if citizens are okay with the violence and brutality seen within prisons? The goal of prison needs to be reform. If more money was spent on reforming prisoners and nonviolent sentences were reduced, taxpayers and communities would benefit greatly. This paper highlights the safety and financial benefits of reforming prisons. However, the strongest reason cannot be found in statistics or research articles. Reason number one for prison reform is that it is the morally right thing to do. This country needs to come to terms with real criminal justice reform in this land of the free. One thing I want us to notice is that there is no new information presented in this paragraph. There's no citations, no research. Your conclusion should not be, oh, this is just a last-minute attempt to throw in a final quote. No, you want your conclusion to tie all of your ideas together and to leave the reader with something to think about. So try to find a way to do that. I know sometimes that can be challenging, but again, use the so what method, right? So as I was doing this, I was asking, well, so what? Why should anybody care about prison reform? And I ended up going with a moral appeal. So we should care about prison reform because it's something that most people might think is necessary, and we need to do that to care about other human beings. So just try to think through that so what question, and I think that'll help you a lot with coming up with your conclusion. All right, that's it. So you may notice that when you are looking at your intro and your conclusion that they're way shorter than those body paragraphs, and that's okay. That's the body paragraphs. That's where you're going to be putting in all of your research, your information, your explanations. So those should be pretty significantly longer than your intro and conclusions. That's all I got for us today. If you have any questions, make sure you let me know. Talk to you soon.